the Herald Sun spends a lot of time, your opponents would say, depicting women in a fairly traditional and often demeaning role when it comes to footy. And I'm not really a fan of the word wags, and it's not something that I particularly enjoy. I think sometimes, and I think even some of the players' wives this year going into the Brownlow felt that you weren't doing women, and women themselves in footy weren't doing other women any service at all by the way they were sort of perpetuating this myth of having to look absolutely fabulous.
Yeah, it's true. The Brownlow, from a sort of news covering angle, has become much more about the red carpet, or whatever colour carpet is now, than actually the count later in the night. That it's almost become secondary. And a lot of it's definitely been driven by the online world, because it happens before it's on TV. So for us, that's a way in to it, something we've got to ourselves. We think we have the best photographers in the world, so we put a lot of emphasis on the photographs. When you say the way it reflects upon women in footy, it's probably unfortunate there's not many other ways, there's not many other areas of women in footy other than another story about Chelsea Roffey, the goal umpire. But the online world just constantly craves this feedback, the rating of stuff, and things like whether it's the dresses at the Brownlow or the dresses at the Logies or does tend to lead towards stuff being ranked really quickly, and I suppose that's part of what you're referring to. I know a lot of the wives have been spoken about how upset they were about the comments made about them afterwards. I think particularly one of the North Melbourne players' wives. And they didn't sign up for that way I think a footballer's got to cop it if we write that they've played a bad game and rate them 1 out of 10 because they've agreed to get paid a lot of money to play footy, so part of that is they get judged. And so it probably is unfair on their partners that they get that instant sort of feedback and reaction. But whether we drive that, it's sometimes really hard to pick out the chicken and the egg there. If we would feel, I guess if you look at the Age website, they're fighting us to get the first picture of the wags up. If you look at 9MSN, if you look at Big Footy, if you look anywhere, that's what, even if it's user generated, that's what they're choosing to put up. And
we live in the best city of the world, in the world, I think. And often I have walked out of the MCG and down to the State Theatre, for example, and we can do it. It's all geographically there for us, isn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing.
And I'm talking about women again, and I suppose, Pippa, it's nice that you say that about Chelsea Roffey, but there are 2 women AFL commissioners and an AFL woman on the executive of...
14 of the 17 clubs have women on the board, and 50% of fans are women, and half the AFL and the AFLPA are women, but those stories aren't sexy. So, I wonder who actually perpetuates the myth.
Stories about homosexuality in football are sexy. Now, you, when you were working for the AFL Players Association, drove a player-led campaign, and I think you and Daniel even did a bit of a gig on Joy FM. Is that right? How did that start? And tell us about how the Akermanis article, your involvement in the Akermanis article, and how that overtook all the work you were trying to do.
Well, what happened early in the year, we had been approached by a couple of advocates from the gay community to think about how sport could help have the hard conversations about homosexuality in sport and in the community generally, and the fact that homophobia as an issue is a cause of serious mental health issues among Australia's youth, and there's 5 times higher suicide rates in young gay people than there are in the rest of society, and it's really a problem. And like most things in sport, we have the same issues as we see in Australian community more broadly, just sometimes more highlighted or more exaggerated. So I decided to talk to the playing group about this, and I spoke to the executive and delegates at the conference last year in November and said, hey, this is what I'm thinking. This is what I'm thinking about homophobia, and how might we be able to put our voice to the community voice to say homophobia is not okay with us, and to move the issue away from somebody having to be the poster boy for being gay and coming out, which is just frankly too much pressure on one individual who doesn't choose to do that, to it being a communal football voice saying, we don't really care if you're gay or not, and there are more important things about who you are as a person that matter to us. Football's a game for everybody. So, and the players were, I have great respect for the players, but they surprised me even in their openness and willingness to get engaged in that. And we did a poster campaign, and Daniel's poster, I think, said "Equality for Redheads," which was which was wonderful. But so players chose what they wanted to say themselves about tolerance, diversity, and particularly with an emphasis on sexual diversity. And the message was really about inclusiveness in the game. That was really successful.
Does the game have that responsibility, though? Do you think, Daniel, or you can answer that too, Pippa, does the game have a responsibility to all these other social issues when you signed on as a kid to play footy?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. We have this argument all the time in all areas, whether it be general behaviour off the field, on the field. It's just that whole role model aspect of life, and we've had to come to terms, or we probably just have to accept that we are role models, and therefore we must act accordingly and lead by example and do the right things. As AFL players, we try as much as we can to be proactive, getting involved in programs like this because we feel we can make a difference and because it is the right thing to do. However,
pressure on you, I'm sorry to interrupt, because of every year the AFL gets more and more government funding under headlines of education, Indigenous, obesity, social reform. Is that drummed into you at all?
Well, we do endless hours behind closed doors when it comes to all those things. So whether it be looking after ourselves financially, avoiding drugs and alcohol, respect for women, homophobia, whatever it is, we address on it. But the main pressure comes from the outside. It's predominantly media driven and socially driven. So they're the parts of society that we're constantly having to raise the bar with regards to standards to. And it gets harder and harder because as we get better, the bar seems to get higher. So the footballer of 10 years ago didn't do anywhere near the hours, or probably wasn't quite as socially aware as the footballer of today. However, in another 10 years, we'll probably see exactly the same. And I suppose the comparison sometimes we ask needs to be made is, are other sports in Australia, and especially overseas, held to the same accountability that we are?
Well, I would say, of course, you're more accountable because you're more famous. People just don't care about cricketers as much anymore, except for well, they don't, do they? And as a result, your association, and you're going for more money again next year. I think at the moment you get about 23% of the pie. You're going for about 27%, and most people would say you deserve that of the AFL's total revenue. But there is a payback, isn't there?
Well, I suppose there is, yeah, definitely. But at the same time, we also get the highest attendance. So we get the most people through the gate. We get the highest amount of people watching on TV. So that's where the income is driven. The income isn't driven by what I do outside of the football arena. I mean, I train hard and I study and we go through all this education. But when we do something negative off the field, that's what tarnishes our reputation the most. And that's nothing to do with being a footballer as a profession. That's only to do with being a role model because we are footballers. So sometimes it's hard to actually justify. Of course, we want to be well behaved, but at the same time, who gets to hold the stick and whack us when we're wrong?
Well, several people, as it happens. Chris, I'll bring you into the discussion.
Okay.
No.
I'm just keeping my shoes on. Yeah.
Daniel talked about role models and behaving badly, and at the moment 2 Collingwood footballers are a subject of a police investigation into a sexual assault that may or may not have happened on the night of the second grand final. Now, do those sort of events affect exhibitions and prizes like the Basil Sellers Art Prize? I mean, when you signed on to sponsor this wonderful award, you did it because you love the game. But those sort of things really hurt the game, don't they? Do they hurt things like Basil Sellers?
Well, I'm glad you're asking me that as an art museum director and not as a Collingwood fan, because I think I'd have a very different answer. Look, I think that at one level, I should add, over the course of 2 Basil Sellers Art Prizes, I've seen entries for this large prize from I've seen 700 entries, so I've got a pretty good sense of what artists out there are interested in when it comes to sport. And as a general rule, it actually goes to your point, you don't see a lot of artists making artworks about the game as such, high marks or catches in slips. most of the artists are interested in precisely that. What goes on around the game? What does it stand for? Or what kind of fault lines in contemporary society does it reveal? And in some regards, whilst many of the artists are fans of sports, they're very critical fans. So when something negative happens, they fall on it. And interestingly, one of the paintings in the current exhibition is a painting of Michael Clarke and Lara Bingle, going back to the WAG discussion. And, Lara Bingle is like 50 times bigger, literally, in the painting than poor old Michael Clarke, who's literally dwarfed by the interest in the starlet, so to speak. And, I think that's what attracts artists' attention, that kind of curious warping of values that, though I'd equally add, one of the other artists in the exhibition, Eric Bridgman, is working from the perspective of gay man. I mean, he made these very funny videos based on the kind of theatrical half-time celebrations that many sports have. And you remember some years ago the NRL had Tina Turner, a gay icon, out singing Better Than All the Rest at the start of the games. He made this funny video called Gayer Than All the Rest, and and suggested maybe have a competition to see who can be the most outrageously gay. Artists are very interested in those kind of strange warped perspectives rather than out and out moral judgments. Because someone will come after them with a big stick. Artists can get away with most anything.
So when it became clear, and Jason Ackermanis confirmed it in his book, that he had had several discussions with you and the AFLPA before he wrote that article, and he claims in his book he made a lot of false claims, so I should verify that this is true, that you encouraged him to write an article about homosexuality in football. You'd done all this work, everyone has forgotten about that. People still hold your red hair against you. No, but there was a lot of really good work done, and it got completely lost in the debate, didn't it?
Yep, it did.
Do you regret that now? Do you regret choosing Acker as your poster boy?
It depends what happens from here, Caro. The reason I approached Jason and asked if he'd be interested in writing something, because some of the feedback that we'd had in the midst of our campaign was that it was ABC and age-centric, and that we needed to reach a broader readership through the Herald Sun. And Jason obviously has a column in the Herald Sun, and he had written really positively about homophobia previously, about 18 months previously. And a woman called Caroline Simons, who is a prominent researcher in this area, had told me about that. And so I called Jason, went and had a coffee with him and talked to him about what we were doing, and whether he thought his voice would be a good addition to the debate. Told him about the stats, told him about the situation in sport, told him about why we were doing it and how it had come to pass, and put him in touch with the anti-violence prevention campaign in Victoria. He spoke to a few other people as well that were well versed in homosexuality in sport and what that means, and then it was all good until the 12th hour, the 11th hour, I should say, and the rest is history. So I don't regret the amount of attention it got, in terms of the fact that people on trams and in regional football clubs were talking about homophobia and saying, does it really matter? I think actually the outcome among common man was that a lot of people had the discussion to say, I don't really think homosexuality is a big deal, but homophobia is a big deal. So I don't regret it from that perspective, but obviously it created a lot of heat, and it also slowed down the progress that we might otherwise have made on this issue. So, I say, let's see what happens now, because if the issue's cold and we don't do anything else about homophobia in sport and footy, that's a real shame.
So go on, Finn.
So one of the reasons I wanted to get into sports journalism from way back when, it was, I think sport doesn't often enable you to talk about parts of society that are harder to talk about in other areas. Like, it does get in, and you look back sort of to the sports writing in America in the 1960s when they'd talk about Cassius Clay, who enormously divisive, and it was a long time before America took him to their bosom. But sports writers were probably the first people to kind of really be able to talk about it openly in newspaper pages, where racism was considered sort of a sales killer. You didn't really want to talk about even civil rights. And I think definitely, in Australia, still sort of some of the iconic images around the progress towards reconciliation with Aboriginal people, like the image of Nicky Winmar or Michael Long and Damien Monkhorst, that sort of stuff. And so maybe Pippa's right, maybe we'll look back and say it was an unfortunate sort of toe in the water, but maybe that's where the wave's going to come from, to mangle a few metaphors.
It's interesting, Carrie, one of the things that we talked about at that conference where I first spoke to the players about it was that we had an opportunity, not a responsibility necessarily, but an opportunity to do something, and it wasn't off the back of a watershed crisis like, Nicky Winmar, like that situation, or it wasn't off the back of a rape allegation or anything else. It was just something we felt like we could do and we ought to do. So actually all of the Ackermanis heat meant that there was then a crisis. Maybe that's how it will play out.
The thing, because the game's so big now, I mean, we have the best athletes, we have some of the best administrators, we have some of the best media performers, writers now involved with the game. And obviously with all these footballers and 2 new clubs, we've got more footballers and a lot of smart footballers. And it seems to me that in the end you do want to win and get fit and play really good football. That's what you're there for. But I find, Daniel, I don't know about you, there seems to be a bit of a resentment at a lot of the clubs that certain players are shouldering these responsibilities. I mean, clearly in your case at Richmond, you're the delegate and the captain has to do his bit. And obviously last year there was a distraction of Ben Cousins. Well, that's gone now. And other players, they just don't want to know about this. And I don't blame them.
No, in a club like Richmond, everyone's so young that the senior players have to take responsibility. But I think if you look at the representatives in regards to delegates and captains, they are the guys who get used as spokespeople because they are firstly the ones who want to have a response to these kinds of things. They have an opinion, and generally they're there because they are leaders. So they are going to lead not just for their team but for AFL players. I don't know, so many of the players are so young that I don't think they would really have an understanding of some of the issues. I mean, I know if I asked 44 of my teammates about the homophobia thing, they probably wouldn't understand the issue. And the issue isn't that could there be a gay footballer, is that right or wrong? The issue is, do the 44 players in a team accept, or would they accept a teammate? And although Jason Ackermanis' comments were a toe in the water of what was a positive campaign, he did raise the crucial point is that it's acceptance. It's not the fact that there probably is a gay footballer out there, or there could be. It's the fact that people are unsure whether they'd be accepted, and that could be at regional level, at local level, or in an AFL club. So whether 43 players and 43 players don't say anything and one does is kind of irrelevant publicly, because what the most relevant part is privately, would 44 players accept that gay player, and that's at this stage we don't know. But I like to think with the campaign and the amount of players that got behind it, that there'd be an absolute minority, if hopefully not zero, players who wouldn't actually accept a gay teammate.
And Cara, when it was stopped in its tracks, the players were actually willing. Like Brad Sewell and Drew Petrie did some video clips, and they were willing for that to go to TV. They were willing for their images of the posters to be on Yarra trams, had all sorts of things that were sort of lined up at that point that can still happen. These things can still be progressed from here. So there is a willingness for the players to speak out about it. It's about the channels and the mechanisms and the support to foster that. So when we ask, does the game foster inclusiveness and diversity, I come back to that point of, who is the game and whose responsibility is that?
Well, ultimately it starts at AFL headquarters and it filters down to the clubs, and we all, the general public, look at it through the players, I guess, most of all. Although Andrew Demetrio has become a fairly loud voice in Australian sport.
They want to be cops, the AFL.
Yep, and he loves his voice too, and he likes making a lot of noise sometimes. But is it fair to criticise, and I say this about clubs and the AFL, in perpetuating that tolerance and that acceptance? And I'll use Richmond as an example again, only because you're here, Daniel. Richmond are about to open a massive new facility under the heading of Indigenous learning and culture, and yet your own Indigenous footballers, many have come to the club and not lasted long at all. And I know Richmond isn't the only club with that situation, and another one has gone now, and a couple this year came down from various parts of Northern Australia and didn't make it. Sometimes I wonder whether we deserve all the accolades we get in this game.
I think in this case I can talk about the similar argument that I said before about separating on the field and off the field. So on the field, we're responsible for playing the game and being as fit as we can and performing to a high standard. Off the field, we're only held accountable by the outside media and the outside society. When it comes to with regards to the issue just raised then with our Indigenous players, we haven't had a great strike rate of recent history, probably with regards to who we've drafted and the fact that they've had to come from a long way into state. And I think the main issue has been how we've sort of accommodated them in their general lives, so whether we brought their families or not and that kind of thing. There's a myriad of issues there, but you can separate that on-field performance again with this institute that we're putting in place, because regardless of how well our Indigenous players play on the field, if we're doing as much as we can off the field and getting in school groups and football teams and the best leaders from Alice Springs and Darwin and the communities around the Northern Territory, bringing them to Melbourne, giving them training for 2 weeks and sending them home, and then continuing that education through TV links and whatnot, there's lots of things we could go on to doing. I think that's all positive regardless of what our on-field performance is. So once again, it's separating the on and off-field. And I think in this case, it's the off-field that's most important. I mean, for any Richmond supporter, of course, who wanted a Richard Tamlin to win us a premiership and win the best and fairest. But when it comes down to it, he was a great teammate. He did what he could, and he felt better to go to another club and try again, and maybe similar with the other cases. But if we can get the next Kathy Freeman to come to our club and do her apprenticeship and win a gold medal, and you could cite many more examples, that would be a massive win for the club and for general society as well.
Going back to women, my view is that football still does struggle with its relationship with women, and we've seen that on every level, in my view. I'll ask you, Chris, what about women artists? I mean, Finn and I know that it's very hard to get a woman on the back page of a newspaper, unless it's the Olympics and she's a swimmer. Or something along those lines. What about women artists in the Basil Cellars? How many entries did you have this year? And how many were women?
I mean, I'd have to say out and out, yeah, look, I mean, AFL football doesn't have a monopoly on sexism, you know, overt or implied. This year's Basil Cellars Art Prize, we have in the exhibition a short list, I think, of 14 artists. Now, 3 of them are women, 3 out of 14, and 2 of them are working as a collaborative team. So really, it's a small amount. The curiosity is, and perhaps it parallels your earlier question, if you looked at the gross number of entries, I think the younger the artists get in that entry pool, the more it is a 50-50 balance, which means, now look, if you go to an art school, it is about 50-50. And yes, there's a glass ceiling in the art world, because if you go to the National Gallery of Victoria, you're not going to see 50-50 on the walls. So yes, there's entrenched barriers, but it seems to me the interesting thing is the younger artists, the younger women artists are just as interested in sport as a topic. Whereas, you know, you go to the older, no, it's all blokes, you know. Over 50, you know, there's hardly any women artists who are interested in the topic. So I'm seeing, I mean, a woman's interest in sport, say as an artist, isn't going to eliminate sexism in sport, but the more people who are involved in the conversation, you know, asking questions or challenging, the better. And, you know, to go to the earlier comments, the thing that struck me in both of these Sellers Prize exhibitions is, and it goes a bit to your point, Finn, is how willing audiences are to discuss very difficult issues using sport as an alibi. I mean, just take the Beijing Olympics, for example. If you'd elbowed someone on a tram and said, hey, let's talk about human rights in China, they would have looked at you funny. But if you'd said to them, gee, what do you reckon they're going to do about Tibet during the Olympics? You know, you'd get an answer. And I think that's the other side of it. Sport is an incredible alibi for, you know, it smuggles in so many things we'd rather not talk about elsewhere.
And I think if you looked at the statistics in regard to, say, the corporate employees around Melbourne, you'd find that the numbers, again, are skewed to there being many more males than females in high management positions I think at the lower level though, in grad programs, it's an equal intake, if not more, to the side of women. So maybe as an AFL player, speak for the AFL, that we actually have quite a high number of representatives throughout the AFL working and at clubs and on boards and whatnot. So maybe we are already a leader there. Yet once again, if one player or three players, and in the recent case, have an off-field discretion, it ruins the whole reputation, because that's what people want to read about. That's what 160 people sitting in here want to read about. They don't want to open up the back page and see that there's another female board member on the Richmond board. That's what we want to know about, because we know it adds much more diversity to the arguments that are held on those boards. But the readership generally don't. I'm sure you guys would be aware of that.
Yeah, I'd actually be interested to ask you something, Cara, not to upset the apple cart. The flow of things. The age has been really progressive in, it appears from the outside, to introducing women into the sports department. You've got some really high profile and really talented young journalists there. Have you seen that they report on football differently to the men you've worked with?
I think it depends on the person. Emma Quayle has made young footballers in the draft. Her absolute specialty. I tell her she's got to stop going to 21st. But she really has, and she's an absolute expert on it, among men and women. I think obviously, I write features, I write comment pieces, I write hard news stories, and I'm fairly strong in my opinions. And then you have someone like Samantha Lane, who writes beautiful features and is also a really good, tough news writer. But I remember Sam pushing to get a job at the Age, and my sports editor saying to me, I think we've got enough women on staff, haven't we? I don't think we need any more. And to me, it wasn't an issue of whether she was male or female. Chloe Salto, as a chief cricket writer, probably isn't as newsy and hard edge in her reporting as Robert Craddock was for the Herald Sun. So I think it definitely depends on the person.
But it's interesting, Caroline, say, you would like a person to be assessed on merit for a role, but it's also worth considering that, when you have diversity in your workforce, whether it's, in media or whether it's in football, you do get a different view. You get a less homogenised view than you do with white middle-class males running the game, sort of thing. We need that diversity to allow a different perspective, to challenge the status quo and the sort of unthinking custom and tradition, so that we can progress. And especially on the hard basket issues like racism, sexism, you need Indigenous people to be talking about Indigenous issues in sport. You need women to be talking about women's issues in sport, as well as men. So if they're not in among the mix, the conversation is stilted from the start. So you do need to consider that as well as the merit.
Yeah, my view is that culturally we are the most welcoming football code in the world, and we're certainly the most welcoming sport in this country in terms of the women and men who watch it, which is almost 50-50, by the ratio of Indigenous players who do make it in our game compared with the ratio of Indigenous people in this country. In terms of size, Daniel, despite what the rule makers are trying to do, you can still be very tall and very short and be all different sizes to play the game. So, I think it's wonderful in all those areas.